Is it time to start? Good morning, good afternoon, good night, everybody. I hope you had a good time, and I will start the session on behavior and transportation demand change, concurrent session. This is a very big theme, and so the steering committee decided to focus on urban transportation, neglecting all the other forms of transportation and purposes of transportation. Due to COVID, we have really a large number of changes, behavioral changes in urban transportation. And this session will highlight some of these changes. And of course, ICEF will look on the impacts on climate change. And so our question we will hope to answer is, are these changes which happened in urban transportation good or bad for the environment, or which of these changes are good and bad for the net zero, let us say? And are these changes which happened, are they likely to stay, or they may be changed if the pandemic, the COVID pandemic is over? Another topic which we should discuss is what are these changes, what are the implications of these changes on technologies? Because ICEF believes, or many of the people in ICEF believe that technology will, at the end, the solution to the problem of climate change. And so are these changes which happened in this year, are they good or bad for the technology development or the deployment of technologies? Another topic is, of course, the infrastructure. What are the relevant impacts from this COVID pandemic on the infrastructure of urban transportation? Does it make sense to invest a large amount of money into additional metro lines if people are afraid to use the metro because of infections, as example? But there are also other innovation technologies, namely digitalization. Can these technologies here help to bring people back into public transport? Another topic is, of course, business concepts. Some of the business concepts in urban transportation are challenged to this pandemic, changes in the pandemic. An example in Germany is car sharing. People are afraid to share a car because they don't know whether they will get infected if they use this car. But again, this we should discuss. Business concepts, which business concepts could emerge in this pandemic? Which are the business concepts which may leave the market? Another topic is gender. Maybe the pandemic has impacts on the supply of public transport, in particular urban transport, public transport in the cities, and maybe this has also effect on gender. Maybe we can highlight a little bit what are the implications of these changes on gender aspects, and at the end, again, what will happen once the pandemic is over. And last but not least, we will, of course, should discuss political recommendations. What are the implications of that, all what we discussed to politicians? Of course, we will. The politicians have two tasks to solve. One is to stop the spread of the pandemic, and the second one is, of course, to the road towards net zero. So that both how the politicians could bring these both aims together so that we have a good future ahead of us. So that will be the topics we should discuss at the end. And I'm happy to announce to you that we have 3 outstanding speakers today, which are from important international institutions and from academia. The first speaker we will have today is Dr. Brian Motherway. He is Director on Energy Efficiency Division at the International Energy Agency in Paris. So he will report the insights from their work here. Our second speaker will be Dr. Aruturo Ardila-Gomez. He is an economist and transport economist from the World Bank. And I think he has also important things. I am happy to have him here on the floor. And our last speaker is Professor Hayashi. He is director from the Center of Sustainable Development Global Smart City in Kyushu University in Japan. And he is also immediate ex-president of the World Conference on Transportation Research Society. So this will be our third speaker. The procedure of this session is as follows. We will start with these three presentations. After each presentation, we have a short round of questions concerning, is there some clarities? Maybe you want to highlight some things which you did not understand or which was not clearly presented. And after the three discussions, I will lead a global discussion. I will ask some questions and hope you as participants will also ask questions. And I assume you know how you do it. We have we have a chat, and this chat you can ask your questions in this chat, and then I will see these questions. I will ask the questions to our speakers. So this is my introduction, and I look forward to a very interesting, exciting session. And Brian, I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much to the conference organisers for the invitation to join you today. It's morning here in Paris. It's a wet, wintry morning, so I hope the weather is better wherever you are in the world. And I do once again thank you for the chance to participate. So I would like to update you on some of our latest data on the pandemic's impact on urban mobility and the energy and climate implications of that. First of all, of course, we know that the world is still under various degrees of lockdown. And in the next slide, you'll see the stringency index showing extent of lockdown in different parts of the world. Next slide, please. Of course, there still remains great deal of variation and great deals of uncertainty in terms of discussion, certainly here in Europe, of a second wave. Some countries at very different points in terms of lockdown and containment of their societies, which of course has huge implications for many factors of our lives and our well-being, not least urban mobility. So next slide, please. And you will see that, of course, all urban mobility activity dropped to almost zero a few months ago at the start of the pandemic. And it's interesting to see how different the pattern has been there in certain cities. And you'll see that here in Paris, activity has returned to almost normal levels, whereas in other major cities, activity is still extremely low. Next slide, please. We're tracking the impact, of course, of this change in activity on oil demand, and in particularly its impact for this conversation on gasoline and diesel and the products that drive urban transportation. And of course, as we all know, global oil consumption is dramatically down on this time last year, and we expect it to remain down for the rest of the year and until the situation changes in the pandemic. Next slide, please. When I talk about urban mobility patterns, of course, as you have said, Chair, we need to think about different aspects of urban mobility. And in particular, we see a particularly dramatic impact on public transport usage. First of all, due to the lockdown itself, and secondly, due to people's very understandable concern about returning to public transport, particularly crowded urban public transport systems. And that seems to remain in place, where even in cities where most people have returned to work, or at least a majority have, and we see transport increasing, such as in cars, we don't see that recovery yet in public transport. Next slide, please. And of course, the drop in public transport is being compensated by other modes. So in fact, as of the middle of this year, we saw that both driving and walking were in fact higher than they were before the lockdown to various degrees. And as you said in your introductory remarks, Chair, it's understandable why that is. Obviously, from a sustainability point of view, seeing a growth in walking is a very different implication than seeing a growth in driving. Next slide, please. As well as commenting on behavior patterns, I wanted to comment briefly on the behavior changes in purchase of vehicles. It's no surprise that overall car sales are down in 2020. Based on the latest data, we think they'll be down of the order of 16%. Compared to last year, but it's notable that relatively speaking, electric vehicle sales are holding up. Electric vehicle sales are a small proportion of the overall car market, but a fast-growing one. And we expect that sales of electric vehicles in relative terms to be quite good in 2020, certainly compared to other types of vehicles. And one can imagine the kind of thought processes in informing decision-making in terms of people wanting to be more resilient, people want to lower their costs, and of course people thinking about quality of life and environmental issues in their purchase decisions. Next slide, please. In terms of the CO2 implications of all this, so you see in this graph, first of all, you can see the blip, as I will call it, in 2020. CO2 emissions in 2020 will see a historic fall, possibly the greatest fall in emissions that we have ever recorded. This is not something to be celebrated. While it is nice to see emissions going down, it is happening for all the wrong reasons. It's because people's health and well-being have been negatively impacted, people's lives have been curtailed, and all of our economies have been constrained and damaged in significant ways. So it's not a good basis to which to underpin a change in direction in CO2 emissions. What happens next is entirely up to policy. We saw after 2009, even though emissions dropped because of the financial crisis, they very quickly rebounded and grew to historically high levels. And therefore we anticipate the same is at risk of happening after this pandemic unless governments take action. And that is why the International Energy Agency is calling strongly for all governments to build clean energy and decarbonisation into their recovery plans and to find ways to align economic recovery and job creation with clean energy transition goals. Of course, this has tremendous opportunity for alignment because there are real opportunities for job creation in key energy transition sectors that can be mobilized now through government policy, through economic stimulus in many areas such as vehicle manufacture, appliance manufacture, batteries, and of course areas such as infrastructure rollout, electric vehicle charging, walking and cycling infrastructure. So there are many opportunities to align short-term imperatives for job creation and economic stimulus with longer-term sustainability goals. Finally, next slide, please. I just want to say to you that the IEA is working with governments around the world on these issues, and we remain a willing partner of everybody participating in this event to help understand the current situation and the necessary next actions. So if you visit our website, you will find tracking of the latest trends and their energy implications. But more than that, you'll find our IEA Sustainable Recovery Plan highlighting the opportunities to align short and long-term goals, drawing on lessons from previous crises, looking at specific policy options that are available to governments. And more, I want to highlight that we're working on behavioral dimensions, and we'll publish very shortly new research on insights from behavioral policies around the world that help us understand what governments can do to help drive behaviors in the right direction, to help sustain the positive behaviors we've seen in recent months and to help avoid a return to the less sustainable ways of the past. Thank you very much, Chair.
Yeah, Brian, thank you very much. Very highlighting data which you presented us. You talk about electrical vehicle, but you didn't mention fuel cell vehicle, hydrogen technology. Is it by intention, or do you IAE doesn't believe in hydrogen, or what is the reason?
We strongly believe in hydrogen, Chair, and my figures today were on current car sales. And as you'll know, battery electric vehicles make up the largest proportion of, shall I say, non-fossil fuel vehicles. So at the moment, the sales of battery electric vehicles are much more significant in the car market than hydrogen or fuel cell. But of course, we see that evolving in many ways, and we know that there are many exciting developments in hydrogen, not just in the transport sector, but also in the industry sector and many others. So certainly we think that hydrogen is going to become a very significant component of the clean energy transition. But right now, in terms of passenger vehicle sales, it's relatively small.
Okay, thank you. It's simply for clarification. Our second speaker is Aruturo Gomez. Arturo, could you please start your presentation? Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to ICEF for the invitation to speak. I am going to continue what the previous speaker began. Next slide, please. By showing a slide that echoes what Brian said in terms of the impact of the current pandemic on urban transport. It's from MoveIt and for a series of cities and an aggregate of cities also, and shows the dramatic drop and the slow recovery. Next one, please. Particularly in the developing world, the client countries of the World Bank, where public transport tends not to be subsidized, this drop in demand has meant a direct drop in revenue, in the fare box revenue, while fixed costs stay pretty much the same, which is translated into financial instability of the operators. Next, please. We further see that public transport can enter what we call a vicious cycle in this response, because there are constraints on the number of passengers the buses and the metros can carry. Some operators have resorted to lowering the frequency, which is a mistake, as I will argue later on. And the users, because there are still people who need to use public transport, as I will show, could opt for a motorcycle or for a car. And we hear indeed that public transport is not safe and that individual modes of transport are the solution to the pandemic. That is wrong on many grounds, including from the management of the pandemic. Next one, please. The labor market. This pandemic is impacting, and many people are losing their livelihoods. Many people are suffering, particularly those people that to make an income need to leave their houses. So those are precisely the ones that continue to need transport, public transport, or any way of getting around the city in order to make an income. Next one, please. People like me, or many of us connected to this event, we could say we're white collar. And I have been working, I work at the World Bank. My main client is Egypt, and I have done at least 5 virtual visits to Egypt instead of going there since the pandemic started. I have achieved almost the same results, except visiting the works that the World Bank loans are financing. But rest assured, the World Bank has developed an application for my smartphone. This will soon be deployed. A local person plus a drone would do a lot of the supervision. So maybe from 6 to 8 trips a year to Egypt that I was doing, I will end up doing at the end maybe 2. A permanent drop in demand in this case for air travel. But next slide, please. I am able to survive in my house because the supermarket nearby, the restaurants, and other essential stores and essential businesses for me to survive are stocked, are properly supplying what I need in order to survive. So I cannot claim that via the internet we can do everything. There are a lot of people that I myself need, as I said, in order to survive. And those people in turn need to leave their houses to be able to make an income, or in the case of the first responders and medical staff, to help us cope with the pandemic. Next one, please. This quote is interesting because it comes from Europe, an area with high motorization. Many European countries have 600 cars per 1,000 inhabitants. And this is a joint declaration in the context, of course, of sustainable transport, but still saying that walking, cycling, and public transport will be essential for the recovery after the pandemic, because many people have lost their jobs. Many people are unable to afford anymore a car, for example. And those people will need a sustainable transport way to get around. Next one, please. This framework is familiar to people in Japan because precisely I took it from the government of Japan, and it has been incredibly useful, and I understand it has resulted in very positive outcomes in Japan. It tells us that this virus in particular, we need to avoid closed spaces, crowded spaces, and close contact conversations. This is what I have heard, to offer an example of what not to do, that many bars and karaoke establishments, karaoke, are precisely violate these principles. Next one, please. So applying this framework and also thinking about greenhouse gases, telecommuting for those who can is great. We don't have to leave our house. I walk to the supermarket, as I said, but this has incredible implications on land use. The downtowns of many cities, for example, Washington, D.C., are deserted, are empty. So we need to think about changing the land use regulation, not only to allow mixed land use in the same block or area, but even within the same building. Some of those offices will not be used again as offices, but they are space, and if we let the market work, the owners of those spaces will transform those offices into apartments. Downtown has to change, and it will be positive to have more people living in downtown. Next, please. Public transport can be safe. It is a myth that public transport is dangerous. I have reviewed extensive literature that says public transport is safe, particularly because operators are following cleaning protocols, very simple with soap and water, but of course there are other more complex chemicals. Users have a role to play by washing their hands and wearing masks. Next one, please. Ventilation. Ventilation is essential, and we might need to retrofit some buses and some metros so that we can open the windows, invest in air conditioning, but we need to improve the ventilation. Next one, please. And we're seeing all over the world what the literature has called in English pop-up bus lanes. Cities are giving priority to buses because increasing the frequency of service is a way to keep a lower number of users, avoid the crowding inside buses, for example. So you need to give priority to the buses in order to improve the frequency. Next, please. So public transport applying the framework can be less crowded thanks to increased frequency to bus lanes. The close contact situation, masks and physical distancing, plus maybe prohibiting speaking while in a public transport vehicle, and ventilation so that the closed space becomes less closed. Next one, please. Biking, by definition, meets the 3C framework very beautifully. You're in open air, and cities are investing in pop-up bike lanes. Next one, please. And walking, we are also seeing what the literature has called alfresco streets or road diets, taking away space from cars and giving it to pedestrians, to restaurants, to bars, so that people can enjoy public space, because roads are also part of the public space. Next. Now, as I said, particularly the poor must leave their houses in order to make income. We hear about the 15-minute city. We hear about the 30-minute city. that with this pandemic should emerge. Land use regulation. We need to relax land use in order to allow the market to work and blend land uses much more than currently are blended. So that really this ideal of the 15-minute city where people could actually walk, or a downtown with not only offices but also residents, could materialize. Next, please. We must not forget climate change. Last summer, we experienced incredibly high temperatures in Siberia, which are just one of the examples. Hurricanes. We run out of letter in the alphabet, for example. Next, please. So to finish, we need to avoid commuting by cars. Yes, public transport is safe and cars are not the solution. Those who can stay at home, stay at home. We need to shift towards walking and biking and public transport and telecommuting. And finally, we need to improve broadband access for those who need it, the frequency of service, and pop-up bus lanes, pop-up bike lanes, and pop-up sidewalks. We need more of those to privilege the sustainable modes. And to finish, next one, please. That is why walking, biking, and public transport are more relevant than ever, not the opposite. The pandemic shows us sustainable transport is the way, and climate change validates even more that view. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arturo, for this good presentation. I have also a short question. You mentioned that public transport is under financial stress because there is a reduced number of people who use the public transport. And at the same time, as you mentioned, it would be good if the public transport would increase its frequency. So this is somehow a problem of financing public transport.
Indeed, it is a question that with my team we are analyzing. We are thinking about a model tested for railways, particularly in Europe, called the Public Sector Obligation Contract and the Multi-Annual Infrastructure Contract, that for railways has allowed to increase service and to lower the cost of the services. We are exploring whether government subsidies in this pandemic, we argue, must not be for free. In other words, just to guarantee some minimum service, should be for increased frequency, should be for opening the windows. Of course, in the countries where I work at the World Bank, the developing world, these subsidies are more difficult to materialize than other countries. So the answer to your question is not easy by any means. Back to you.
Thank you very much. We will, I think, discuss this topic further after the next presentation. And the next presentation comes from Professor Hayashi. Yoshi.
So I will talk 3 points today, how to estimate CO2 emission from transport, then what have happened in transport under COVID-19, and then recommended measures and actions. Next, please. First, how to estimate CO2 emission. The next, please. Next, okay. I have been working on this topic since nearly 30 years. We published a book in 2004, Urban Transport and the Environment, where we proposed this system. This means there are 3 strategies to reduce environmental load. The first one is avoid trips or shortening trips. Then second, if you need to travel, then use low carbon transport. And then that is shift from car to public transport, for example. And then improve is if you really need a car, then technological improvement is necessary. So there are a lot of you can see many strategies and many crossing instruments, right? And then one more click, please. Then we can estimate to enhance different combinations of policies, how avoid, for example, transport frequency or concentration of urban activities, or reverse, or the middle is car ownership increase or reduce, and then fuel economy increase, and etc. Then we can calculate by multiplying each effect. Then we can have all effects. Thank you. And then the next, please. Okay, the next is what happened in transport under COVID. Okay, next, please. World Conference on Transport Research Society, WCTRS, we have about 1,000 members from 70 countries. We conducted expert survey at the end of April. So, and then today I will show you the answers at that time. Okay? You could compare today's feeling and at that time, how people thought. Okay, so what happened in different cities or countries where the experts were living? The right-hand side is public transport to car because afraid of infection, and then or to motorcycle. And the left-hand side is to bicycle, to walking, and others. So about 50-50, the more carbon or smaller carbon. And then the next, please. By a country, so which country shifts more to cars is Korea, 94.4%. The legend is right-hand side, okay? So Korea, and then the next is China, 78%. And motorcycle, the down, 50% in India and 48% in other Asia, Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, such countries. And then the walking is India is 50, and then Europe 60, and then bicycle, Europe is the champion, 58. So in the case of Europe, your efforts for the past 40 years to improve cycle roads was now effective. The next, please. So now this is a data, easily available data, Google data, where people were going or staying, how it changed. In Japan's case, emergency declaration was done, so that is nearly end of March. M20 means 20th of March, okay? And US did lockdown, and then also India, Italy, all lockdown. So the gap between residential location, staying in residence and staying in workplace red is very much gapped. Okay, so and also transit stations. Say Japan's case, transit stations very less. This is partially because we have a so-called railway station front commercial development is very rich. So this does not mean only railways. So go for shopping, downtown reduce. Okay, the next, please. So this is, instead of India, I put it here, France. Okay, so France and India is saying it's not so different where they did stay. Okay, the next, please. But this one is a trend in transport volume. Okay, transport volume. So driving red, transit green, and walking blue. So comparing, it's interesting, comparing France and Italy. In the case of France, public transit, green has recovered, but Italy did not. So we have to examine more. Partially, Italy has been people feel much more, say, careful. And then watching international news, Italian people still have a mask like Japanese, but the French people much less. Brian, do you think so? Not so many people are wearing masks. Okay. So next, please. Okay. Then recommended measures and actions. The next. Okay, so this is recommended measures by the experts. So the right-hand side is online meeting, avoid gathering events, teleworking, online lecture, avoid eating out, and physical exercise, even green, and public transport passenger restrictions. So recommendations, of course, are very much green, right? Okay, the next, this is just recommendations, okay. And more detail, the top one is 18%, 64% fully agree and agreed is more intercity business trips should be online. That is the top one. The second is online services, bank, government, tickets purchase, etc. should be altogether 70% more. And then business trips for meetings should be online. This is intra-city, inside the city. Okay, this is still 70%. And online shopping, 60% recommended. But society, people fear is society may be, or community may be more isolated to each other by online introduction. And online education will be a standard model of education. People think a bit more than 30%. The next, please. And then car dependence will become more obvious to avoid to adverse reactions to crowded public transport. People say about 70%, 65% people think so. And online shopping will become more popular, 60% again. But outer migrate from populated city, still say 20%, or live far away from city center is also 20%. So people with some more experience, the share may be different now. Okay, the next piece, I'll finish up very soon. Then what is new normal, which I imagine is, first one is we should promote downside equilibrium. Okay? So, for example, Japan Rail East has lost 70% of passengers, but they don't expect they will be back 100%. Maybe 60%, 70% at the end. So 30 or 40% of passengers, they will lose. But if you, what is tough for rail operators is investment in infrastructure, or rolling stocks, cars, or personnel costs. So somewhere, this is a number of passengers in peak hour. If this is reduced, then maybe come down. So the happier situation, maybe smaller sales, but much smaller cost. And the peak hour merits, okay, peak hour cut merits also. And then resilience, what is this? Is we have typhoons or earthquakes also, very similar. So we do need a reversible transport system and society system. We have to redesign the cities. Okay, so the systems can be used for normal situation and abnormal situation. And then redundancy of infrastructure and contingency plan we do need. And the transport more small and the benefit large, I told. And Okay, maybe I have already talked about this. The congestion charge should be, okay? So not only congestion, but whole, in my sense, whole space charge of urban sphere is very important. That is a general solution. The next, please. This is the final one. Okay, finally, say healthier outcome of society activities is preferred compared to economic growth in 20th century. So I told the less income, less passengers, it's okay. Higher net income if we can enjoy. And the resilient city I have already talked about. And then never coming chance this is to mindset for human beings. So how to live Anthropocene. This is a very good chance. Thank you.
Yashi, thank you very much. I think you gave us a different perspective to the problem what Arturo explained us. Arturo said we need more frequency in public transport, and you say no, we should try to cut peak, then our frequency is good and the distance in the public transport is okay. So I think we will continue to discussion. But I think what is also coming from one of the questions, we have some questions from our auditorium, and one of the questions is addressing the car. You did not discuss so much on the car in inner city car travel. For example, one of the people asked here in India, vehicle sales is going up due to COVID-19 pandemic. Because it's obvious that if you drive, if you are sitting in the car, then social distancing is easy. And what I can see as a very subjective observation, that the number of car travel is increasing also. We see less public transport, more car driving, and of course more walking and bicycle. Do you agree that this is the trend which we can see today? More passenger cars in the city?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I rather recommend, I have a project in Bangkok. I'm recommending to introduce road surface charge, meaning the kickboard skate. So it is only footprint size. So a very small charge or tax. But Mercedes, BMW, sorry, the German cars, but the Toyota also big cars, Volvo. So big cars, it's okay, but tremendous, say, high tax should be charged. Okay, then that will be optimized because people don't understand using the surface is a big cost, but they don't pay the total cost. So it's a very necessary, this timing, this chance, what is costing on the society? You are costing on the society. So charging that money, then that should be used for, the system development for all the people or even low-income people can use in a shared manner. So that is my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you to all of you. And as I mentioned, I think we should start what happened. And we have already some different view. One was on this public transportation. The problem is how to finance the public transportation if the frequency should increase. We have one of the insights that maybe we don't need to increase additional infrastructure, public infrastructure. We could, it's not necessary to increase public infrastructure for public transport. Because we could make a peak shaving. That means people will use public transport outside peak hours. And I think what Hayashi proposes is to use road pricing or some different model, collecting money to the city, which could be used to finance higher frequency in public transport. Is this a good idea? Is this a sustainable approach, what we propose to the government?
The other's opinion?
Yeah.
If I may, yes. First, I fully agree that public transport will not need to expend resources supplying for a very expensive peak hour. Probably the peak hour is gone because more people are telecommuting now. And this is good news because a peak hour can be 12% of the trips in the day. And the afternoon peak hour can be another 10%. So we have about 78% of the trips that are not during the peak hour. And those are cheaper to supply. And that's why the idea that I put forward of increasing frequency makes sense. If you have priority lanes for buses, the pop-up bus lanes, then the operating costs of buses goes down because buses in the developing world are stuck in congestion, are stuck in traffic by cars that do not pay, as Professor Yoshi was saying, their way. The use of cars worldwide, but in particular in the developing world, is highly subsidized. Parking in the developing world, parking on a sidewalk is frequently not only allowed, but it's free. That's a subsidy for car use that motivates car use and discourages using public transport because people who want to access the bus stop cannot do it safely because of the cars parked on the sidewalk. So I'm all for congestion pricing, in particular charging for car use. I finish by saying a car with, on average, 1.2 people. That's the average in the world, more or less. 1.2, 1.15. 2 cars occupy the space of a bus with 20, 40 people, even in COVID-safe public transport. Thank you.
Brian, you think you want to comment?
Thank you, Georg. I think there's a question of short-term possibilities and longer-term possibilities. And I just take an example here in Paris. The public transport peak is back. You know, people are the metros and buses are full at peak hours, and I think there's an equity issue here because, like in many cities, those who can afford to switch to the car are doing so, and those that can't are still on public transport. And particularly the way Paris is designed, there's a lot of people come in from the suburbs to work because housing is so expensive in the city centre. So clearly that is not a preferable situation, but the question is, how much can we change in what time frame? And Paris is one city that has put a lot of investment into walking and cycling lanes. But again, that probably suits the people who are already living in the central zone. It's maybe not so useful to somebody who lives 20 or 30 kilometers away to help them with their commute. So I think there are a lot of dimensions here that governments are struggling with. What can they enact very quickly versus where they would like to be in a number of years in an ideal situation?
Thank you very much. I have 2 remarks for that. And one is children which go to school. As we have seen by Hayashi, that people don't believe that online learning will be the future. So that means, and of course, children, when they cannot walk to the school, maybe to high school, they must use somehow public transportation. So this, I think, could create a problem if or not. I don't know. What is there's a big discussion. Should we open the school again or should we close the school again? In Europe, it's extremely complicated, but everybody knows homeschooling is not a good idea. So how to solve this in the context with transportation? Okay,
may I respond to you? I think we have to give spaces, public transport to children first. And we adults should not occupy the public transport. Okay, so that means my idea is, okay, so smaller children should go to school because say playing with the others is very, very important to build up himself, the children. Okay, but gradually coming up, and for example, I'm working in university, where universities may be a part of educations can be remote, but not completely. Then we adult workers, okay, we are so stupid. Why stupid? Is all the people believe workplace is fixed at the office in the city center, okay, and many people living outside, and then the working time is fixed from 9 to 5, for example. That's why everyone, the same period of the day, go into the city center. So stupid. Then if we don't do that, we have learned already. So working at home, working at Starbucks, wherever we can work, or most of the things. So make it the time of work and then our time of travel free. And then a place of work also free. So place, space, and say time, 2 dimensions, make it free. Then we should not. We don't need to occupy public transport system. We adult morning time and evening time. So actually, we are now developing application even and to encourage that. And also, I'm recommending to big railway companies, as the government, it's better to introduce a time differentiated fare system. It's understandable. Okay, so that's it. So that will help the boundary condition quite like this. Sorry.
No, I think peak cuts is difficult if you discuss schools. Because I think it is very difficult to organize schools in such a way that each group of children starts school at different times, so everybody comes at the same time and leaves at the same time. So this is a problem which should be discussed, and I could report about Zurich, which is of course not such a relevant city from a world problem, but actually the city or the canton of Zurich is trying to move high schools out of the city center to the outskirts, so that the people, instead of commuting from outside to the city center, the students, they should commute from the city to outside. Yeah. This brings me to another question. It's also one of the questions from the auditorium. Yashi already mentioned that there is a tendency that people leave cities, they move out of the city center to outskirts. So that means this, in principle, has a tendency to have longer travel distance. And of course, Arturo discussed that we should change land use. That means transform office buildings into private homes. But maybe people don't want to live in city centers in the future because of these pandemic risks. Maybe we could comment a little bit about this problem. What will be the settlement structure and the impact on transportation? And in addition, of course, it's already mentioned that if you move to the outskirts, probably walking and bicycle are not the solution for traveling in the city.
Well, I think all the German professor gave a very good hint. And that is Mr. Kristaller.
I think, Arturo, you could mention, you proposed that we should change office spaces in city centers to dwellings for people who live there.
Yeah. Office space can be, say, decentralized many places. And also house maybe, say, I don't recommend very strongly, but if they like, they can move farther from the city center. So, assuming every day commuting in the city center, that's a totally nonsense solution. Okay, increasing more traffic because distance is a double. So before only this section moved, but the another section should move. So the double traffic volume demand will be doubled. So that's total nonsense. So if we don't need to go to the city center, the office every day, so perhaps only once or twice a month, then it's a better solution. And in that case, we do need redesign neighborhood. So in the neighborhood, say, for example, say within 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers from here, so we can walk. So within walking distance, say certain level of shops or clinics, necessary service facilities are there. Of course, a university clinic, it's only Munich and Berlin, such big cities, it's okay. So that is a central place theory that Crystal proposed. So we don't need the same functions in each level of the cities, each size of cities. So a smaller size area, we do need lower level, but satisfactory services should be. So we have to redesign if the function of commuting or frequency of commuting and technology of vehicles or size of vehicles will be, say, moderated, well improved. Then we have many, say, choices for the solutions. Okay, so we don't know. We have rejected to think the other things.
I would like to touch another topic, and this is technology. And the question is, of course, we know that digital technologies could solve a lot of problems, but in the case of post-COVID, what could be ideas how to use digital technologies in order to go to net zero or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from urban transportation? Do you have an idea about this, Brian or Arturo?
Maybe I'll comment just a couple of things. First of all, digital technology in terms of telecommuting, obviously we've all realized, and Arturo said this earlier, we've all discovered how effective it can be to use these kind of tools that we're using right now to discuss things globally, and people obviously in cities are telecommuting much more. However, when we look at the analysis, if people, let's say, were to settle into telecommuting 1 or 2 days a week, the energy and emission savings are actually quite small when you net them out. And in particular, if people feel, previous behavioral evidence seems to suggest if people feel they only come to the office once a week or once a month, they are more inclined to live further away from the cities, and therefore when they do travel, the journeys are considerably longer, and that can actually cancel out the benefits of them not going to the office so often. So the situation is complex. Obviously then in terms of transport management, one thing I'm struck by, we all showed slides that showed very intimate data about how urban mobility is changing from Google Analytics, from City Mapper or Apple. And of course, this data wasn't even available 3 or 4 years ago. It wasn't possible to track urban mobility in such a detailed way. And it reminds us that digital tools are really helping, mobility management and mobility optimization. And I think they will become even more important in the future. I certainly know a lot of people now use apps on their phone to decide whether to use public transport or to walk or to take an Uber or whatever else it is. It's certainly helping optimization of transport systems, and I think that will certainly bring benefits in the future.
Arturo, you have also a comment on digital technology. What could be the role of this to generate
open data? Open data. Cities need to open up their data. Public transport operators need to open up their data and let the market work to develop the applications and create an ecology of applications to predict the next bus, when will it arrive. But the bottom line is open data. It's the regulating the use of data and the ownership of the data that allow many of these technologies by the private sector to materialize. And usually London is the paramount example where Transport for London opened up its data, and within 1 month there were 500 applications to tell users when the next train, when the next bus, and some of those survived and many of those died. Of course, transit providers can also invest in systems to benefit the user. For example, more and more people will use their smartphones, so more and more metros and buses should have recharging stations for those gadgets to make it convenient for users and to keep them quiet, because we don't want them to talk while they're commuting.
Okay, and concerning this open data, who should finance for it? Is this the public transportation company, or should be somewhere else who do collects and finances this open data source?
Well, nowadays, the GPS is so cheap that most buses, most metros have the data on where they are located. The trick is to make the authority open up the data, post it in a GTIF format that is a standardized format developed and accepted in most places in the world, so that any computer can know that the first column is this attribute, the second column is this one, and the applications start working. But here, key is, for example, who owns the data from fare collection, for example. You hire a fare collector that has a smart card, and then all the data belongs to the fare collector, should belong to the government of the city.
This is an important advice to the to the government, so to the urban city regulators. I think it is an important proposal. Another topic which we have should discuss is innovative business models. What is the implication of COVID on the innovative business models, such as car sharing or so? What is your opinion? Is these business models, are they dead, or they can develop, or they can adapt to the COVID consequences?
Okay, so I don't talk too much, but I think the Japanese urban railway system is one of the hints. So that is, railway company is not only for transporting passengers, but in this city center side terminal, we have department stores, say amusement facilities, or even the outside of the city to get the reverse direction demand passengers to get more revenues. Because in many cases, say in the morning, the trains have to go into the city, they're coming back vacant. Like say Arturo told about 1.2 person is using big car like that. So they are transporting air. So that's totally nonsense. So that kind of, the inventor of TOD system, that is Mr. Kobayashi, that was Hankyu railway company in Osaka, so more than 100 years ago. he told, we are not selling tickets for passengers, but we are providing, say, services for life, for living. So that is still, I think, a useful idea. That means vacant capacity of railways, less peak hours. That should be sold. So that is real business. Okay, so we cannot sell the peak hours space because of already congested. Okay, extremely Tokyo and Osaka like this. So
Arturo already showed us that, or told us that in London, once if the data are on the table, then in short time 500 startups emerged with new apps. So that means there is the chance that new technologies and new businesses concepts
so that means
will help mobility.
Yeah. So business is not think only rigidly. Increase supply. So it's impossible. It's impossible. So we have to adjust demand side, so shift, induce the potential demand into a vacant time period, a vacant space. So for example,
next topic is infrastructure investments. Are there good examples for clever, smart infrastructure investments in public transportation? And of course, we have the problem that governments will spend a lot, at least in industrial countries, spend a lot of money in order to to generate economic recovery. And of course, the idea is to use parts of this public money, in order to develop the transportation infrastructure. Are there good examples? I mentioned the example in Switzerland where we moved the schools out of the city center to generate mobility, transport demand from the center in the morning hours, from the center to the outskirts, and not from the outskirts to the center. So that means it is, of course, a very clever idea to invest into new schools instead of new rails and bus lanes in order to organize the public transport in a more efficient way. But maybe there are other examples.
One of the examples, it's rather already 20 years old. Lee Myung-bak, ex-president of Korea, and even before when he was city mayor of Seoul, he did drastic reform of public transport because he wanted to demolish, the city center elevated motorway because it's ugly. But just above very nice river stream, but it was very much stagnant. How to recover the stream, then demolish. But 15% of traffic, for example, 15% of traffic are using the central network of city motorways. So how to be absorbed that amount of demand travel? So then he did it, and what he did is connecting buses and subways together, and utilizing the IT system. For example, during off-peak time, perhaps housewives living outside may wish to go for shopping in the city center. Okay, and in the city center, getting out and again get in, the initial fixed price, is not necessary. Okay, so the price is initial price is even one station, so this is charged, and then like this, then like this. Okay, but this will be free. for returning trip. Then rather many people started to buy things in the city center. So that was a very good business. So that means we should not think only infrastructure only, but always how they are used together. So for that, very simple use of IT, that is simply when the passenger get off the station was detected already, counted. In such a way, nowadays much more high tech we have.
Sorry, Arturo?
This discussion reminds me of land use regulation and that we need compact cities. Land use regulation, for example, in the United States, the myth that people prefer to live in a single family house is actually a myth because it was induced by the entities that guaranteed the mortgages that were by law only allowed to guarantee mortgages for single family houses. And this can be attributed to the lobby by car manufacturers after the Second World War. When the restrictions on that legislation were relaxed and the entities that guarantee the mortgages were able to finance also condominiums or apartments, then those flourished also, because some people want to live not in a single family home, but in an apartment, in a building, in a compact house, in a transit-oriented development, in something that public transport can provide. Back to your original question, cities must continue to invest in public transport, in bike paths, in sidewalks, because otherwise the climate change challenge, we cannot undertake it. If we want to build expressways and highways the way some countries in the developed world have, then we are toast as a planet. Our client countries at the World Bank, there is a greener way, there is a better way to do. And the example from Seoul, Korea, that Professor Yoshi was mentioning, shows us that, for example, at the bank now, when a client says, we want to build an overpass in a city, an elevated road, in other words, we tell them, no, go for traffic management. Let us fly you to Seoul, Korea, where they had an elevated expressway. Now they have a river. Back to you.
I would, Georg, I will come back to Brian, because he mentioned that in Paris there's a large investment into bicycle ways. And one of the problems which I can see, particularly in European cities and in other cities which are very close, so do you have enough space to develop these bicycle roads? And another problem is, of course, it's not quite unsafe to run a bicycle because you have no shelter around you. And what is the implication of more bicycles on accidents?
So obviously it's still early in terms of collecting data, Georg, but what we're seeing so far, first of all, globally, when you look at the investment committed to economic stimulus programs around the world in transport, walking and cycling is possibly the biggest component so far, which is very interesting to note that there's huge investments in walking and cycling facilities in many parts of the world. And to take here in Paris as an example, there's a commitment of spending 300 million euros on walking and cycling infrastructure in the short term. And what we're seeing so far, and it's one of those old idioms, never waste a good crisis. During the lockdown, we saw a lot of temporary cycle lanes put in. We saw a lot of roadway that used to be for cars switch to cycles. And actually not just switch to cycles, but also switch to outdoor terraces for restaurants and different things like that. So we saw quite a bit of repurposing of formerly car space into other uses, which is now being locked in. So there are a few major streets in Paris that are now no longer available to cars except for taxis and buses, and have quite generous cycling facilities, quite safe and attractive. And certainly statistically, cycling has shot up here in Paris. But of course, Paris is not every city, and those kind of facilities really suit people within a certain radius. And I think there is an equity question here to make sure that we're not just taking care of people who can afford to live quite close to city centre and then have the option of switching to cycling and walking. And there are many other categories. But I think one thing we're doing is encouraging governments to align short-term stimulus needs with longer-term sustainability goals, and certain types of infrastructure, not just walking and cycling, but also public transport infrastructure, electric vehicle charging infrastructure. All of these are good ways to create jobs and economic activity very quickly, while also locking in more sustainable systems for the future.
What is your opinion in allowing bicycles in railway transportation? Because the problem is, of course, these peak hours, everybody comes with this bicycle, and so the crowds in the railway is even higher than before. But there is, of course, a tendency, because if we move in the outskirts of the city, how you can use the bicycle, you can use the bicycle to go to the railway station and then take the railway and use the bicycle from the railway station in the city to my place where I want to go. But of course, what is your opinion about this concept?
Well, I think obviously when it can be done, it's a good idea. There's an interesting pilot here in Paris where the public transport company has a bicycle docking system, like many cities have, but it's for peri-urban commuters where they can reserve a rental bicycle at the station they arrive at. So when they come in from the suburbs, they can have a bicycle waiting for them at the train station they arrive at to make the last couple of kilometers of their journey. And I think that's a nice alternative, because obviously the cost of allowing a lot of space on trains for bicycles is not an option for everybody necessarily. So I think some of these more innovative solutions around bike sharing, bike rental, docking stations might have a role to play too.
Okay, these are another proposals from our session. The last point we should discuss is gender issues. And we have a question from Nobuko Tanaka, our president. Men should commit more diversity in society. Does COVID-19 force you housekeeping with your wife? More fair burden sharing in work-life balance? Is this a tendency which is general, or is this only an individual? I have also an individual observation, because restaurants have been closed during some time. I have to learn to cook. Now I can cook, which is maybe also in the direction of gender, because I can do some more housework than before. But is this a chance? Never miss a good crisis. Is this a chance for the future, for gender? Or what is the impacts of the COVID crisis, or the changes following the COVID on gender issues? Do we have an idea?
Well, in the developing world... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please, Arturo, you go ahead.
Oh, thank you. In the developing world, when there is a household with a car, typically it is for the male. The wife has to use public transport, and frequently does what we call chained trips, meaning a series of trips. So there is an excess burden on women, and therefore the need to continue to invest in public transport and sidewalks in particular, and cars not parked on the sidewalk, because they protect vulnerable users such as pedestrians. And a large share of those pedestrians and public transport users are women in the developing world. Back to you.
Okay, Brian?
Well, I was just going to say that in general, a pandemic reinforces inequality. It makes it worse, and it's harder on the people who are at the lower end of the inequality scale. And gender certainly is a dimension there, where women who struggle more with higher burdens in terms of home elements, childcare, and also more difficult access to jobs and access to mobility. A pandemic will, by definition, reinforce all of that. So policy is required to correct that. So far, I haven't seen a lot of data Back to your question, Chair, I haven't seen a lot of data yet to suggest that suddenly men are doing more housework or more childcare. I don't know that happens automatically. I'm sure it happens in some cases, but I don't want to speak anecdotally. But I think it takes policy action to mitigate the inequality effects of a pandemic. I think in general, inequality gets worse under such circumstances, not better.
Okay, I think Yashi, you want to say another word?
Okay, so
gender issue.
I think, as I have already told, to reduce the peak hour congestion, it's a very good thing for women because unnecessary and say very, very bad criminals, congestion level is very high. So that is very good to reduce the peak hour congestion. That is the first. And also congestion in car traffic on road. I have conducted the quality of life, comfortability of road travel. The expansion of lanes is very good for female more than men, because I don't know in Europe, but in Japan, females are driving softer and then not so aggressive. So they don't want to say drive like this, but more comfortable like this. So less congestion in the public transport as well as road congestion. They are also very good for women. So they made young mothers should bring babies or small kids together for shopping. So inevitably they have to go out. So I think this is a very, very good chance to change the systems and the demand so that that is all good for women, I think.
So thank you very much. I think this brings us to the end of our discussion. We have a lot of ideas how to use this chance of this COVID crisis to improve urban transportation. We discussed financial issues, we discussed congestion issues, we discussed land use issues. And in all these fields, there are a lot of, we of course discussed technologies, IT technologies, new city regulation for road pricing, etc. So that means there is a large bundle of instruments available, which could be used to strengthen the good development in terms of urban transportation following the COVID and avoid the bad developments which we have seen in the past. So I think I would thank all of you for this wonderful discussion and the wonderful presentations, and also the auditorium for good questions. And thank you very much for your patience, and stay tuned. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon in Tokyo.